The moment I walked into the will reading room, my wife and her new boyfriend laughed under their breath. "You will get nothing from my dead father." The lawyer went pale. His hand trembled, and he whispered, "Dear God, is that really him?" Everyone turned to stare. They had no idea who I was until the thing about walking into a room full of people who've already written you off is that you get to watch their faces do this spectacular little dance between confusion and panic when they realize they've miscalculated. Badly. And let me tell you, the moment I stepped through those mahogany double doors of Hargrove and Associates, some fancy law firm that smelled like old money and older lies, I got to witness that dance in high definition, and it was absolutely glorious. My ex-wife Miranda was perched on one of those pretentious leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars, and the second she saw me, she let out this laugh. You know the kind I'm talking about? That manufactured Instagram perfect giggle that women like her practice in the mirror until it sounds just fake enough to pass as genuine to people who don't know better. It's the same laugh she used to deploy at charity galas when someone she considered beneath her tax bracket tried to make conversation. The laugh that says, "I've already won, you're just here to watch me collect the trophy." That laugh. The one that made my teeth ache even when we were married, back when I was still delusional enough to think love could fix personality disorders. She was wearing white, because of course she was. Miranda always had this twisted sense of irony, showing up to her dead father's will reading dressed like some kind of grieving virgin saint, when everyone with functioning brain cells knew she'd been counting down the days until the old man kicked it so she could finally get her perfectly manicured hands on his estate. The pearls around her neck probably cost more than I used to make in a month, back when I was stupid enough to think being a good husband meant bankrolling her delusions of grandeur. And there, right beside her, like some kind of designer accessory she'd picked up at the douchebag store, was Bryce. Oh, Bryce. Where do I even start with this guy? He had that whole "I peaked in college and never got over it" vibe going on. Tight suit that was probably cutting off circulation to whatever brain cells he had left. Hair gelled back like he was auditioning for a reboot of American Psycho. And this smug expression that made you want to introduce his face to a wall just on principle. The guy looked like someone had asked AI to generate generic rich asshole number 7, and then gave him a trust fund and a personality disorder for authenticity. Bryce leaned over to Miranda, making absolutely zero effort to lower his voice, because subtlety wasn't really in his skill set, and stage whispered, "You'll get nothing from her father's estate." He said it with this little smirk, like he was some kind of mastermind villain in a movie written by someone who'd never met an actual intelligent person. Cute. Really cute. The kind of cute that makes you wonder how some people manage to dress themselves in the morning without accidentally putting their pants on their head. But here's where things got interesting. Mr. Hargrove, the lawyer handling the estate, this distinguished-looking guy in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him that whole "I've seen some stuff in my career, but this is about to be wild" energy. He just froze, mid-sentence, like someone had hit pause on a DVD player. His glasses literally slid down his nose in that cartoonish way you always think is exaggerated in movies until you see it happen in real life. And he whispered, "Dear God, is that really him?" And let me tell you, when a lawyer who's probably overseen hundreds of estate settlements sounds like he's just seen a ghost walk through the door wearing a Tom Ford suit, you know something's about to go sideways in the best possible way. The whole room turned. And I mean everyone. Miranda's cousin Jessica, who I'd never liked because she had this habit of asking invasive questions about our finances at Thanksgiving dinners. Some guy I didn't recognize who was probably another one of William's business associates, there to pick at the bones of the estate like a well-dressed vulture. Even Hargrove's assistant, this young woman with a tablet who'd been frantically taking notes, just stopped mid-keystroke and stared. The silence hit the air like a fork dropping in an empty cathedral, sharp, sudden, and impossibly loud in its absence of sound. Apparently, I'd gone from being the invisible ex-husband, the one they probably made jokes about over cocktails and expensive appetizers, to being an unexpected plot twist that nobody saw coming. And honestly, I was living for it. See, here's the thing they didn't know. 7 months ago, I was just Julian Cross, regular guy, decent husband, the one who paid the bills on time, built businesses from scratch while Miranda took credit in her Instagram posts. and generally played the role of supportive spouse while she climbed social ladders and spent money we didn't have on things we didn't need. I was the husband who got traded in for someone with better abs, worse credit, and the kind of superficial charm that impresses people who measure worth in bicep circumference and car brands. And I was the guy who came home one day to find half the closet empty and a post-it note that said, "I need someone with more ambition. My lawyer will contact you." A post-it note. Like I was a reminder to pick up milk, not a human being she'd spent 5 years promising forever to. But I'd spent those 7 months doing what any self-respecting man does after his world implodes and his heart gets handed back to him in pieces. I rebuilt. I rebranded. I got my life together in ways that would make those motivational Instagram accounts look like amateur hour. New company? Check. I launched Cross Dynamics, a clean energy startup that Miranda's father had literally laughed at when I pitched it at a family dinner 2 years ago, calling it adorable in that condescending way. Rich people dismiss ideas that might actually change the world because they're too busy protecting the status quo that made them rich in the first place. New wardrobe? Check. Turns out when you're not spending every dime keeping up with a woman whose shopping addiction could fund a small nation, you can actually afford clothes that make you look like you've got your life together. New backbone? Check, check, and check. Because nothing builds character quite like having your heart ripped out, realizing the person you loved was basically a well-dressed parasite, and then deciding that you're done being anybody's doormat, ATM, or emotional punching bag. So I walked into that law office wearing a navy suit that cost more than Miranda's monthly Botox budget, custom tailored, because I'd learned that confidence isn't just about what you wear. It's about wearing it like you own the room and everyone in it. No tie, because confidence doesn't need accessories, and I decided that the new Julian Cross didn't do unnecessary things just because society said so. My hair was cut sharp, my shoes were Italian, and I carried myself like a man who'd walk through fire and come out the other side with a tan and a better investment portfolio. I looked at Miranda and Bryce, sitting there in their bubble of self-satisfaction, completely oblivious to the fact that their world was about to implode, and I smiled. Not a big smile. Not one of those showy look-at-me grins that scream insecurity, just a small, knowing smile. The kind of smile that says, I brought receipts, I've got the email chains, I know where all the bodies are buried, and this is going to be fun. For me, anyway. For them, not so much. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just going to be a will reading. This was going to be a reckoning. Mr. Hargrove was doing his best to regain control of the situation, shuffling through papers with the kind of nervous energy you usually see in people who've just realized they're about to drop a bomb in a room full of egos and entitlement. His hands were actually shaking a little, which I found both amusing and slightly concerning because this guy had probably handled hundreds of estate cases in his career, and yet here he was, looking like he'd rather be literally anywhere else on the planet. Maybe diffusing actual explosives, maybe swimming with sharks. Anything but dealing with whatever circus this will reading was about to become. Miranda, meanwhile, kept flashing me that grin. You know the one, that I'm untouchable smile, that wealthy people perfect over years of getting away with absolutely everything. Because daddy's money or family connections or sheer audacity has always smoothed over their mistakes like some kind of magic eraser for consequences. It's the same expression I'd seen on her face when she'd maxed out our credit cards and acted like I was the unreasonable one for being upset about it. The same look she'd given me when her father had accidentally left me out of family business discussions, even though I was literally the one building the technology that was supposed to save his company from becoming obsolete. That smile that says, I can do whatever I want, and you can't touch me. Here's the funny thing about people who genuinely believe they're untouchable. They usually just haven't met their consequences yet. They're walking around thinking they're made of Teflon and titanium, that nothing sticks and nothing breaks, completely oblivious to the fact that the universe has a pretty solid track record of humbling people who get too comfortable in their delusions. It's like watching someone juggle chainsaws while standing on a frozen lake, convinced they're invincible, right up until the moment everything goes spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. Bryce apparently decided this was his moment to contribute something to the conversation, because he leaned over toward me, giving me an unfortunate close-up view of his overpriced cologne situation, which was aggressive enough to qualify as a war crime in 17 countries, and said, "You shouldn't be here." He said it with this little edge in his voice, Like he was some kind of bouncer at an exclusive club and I was the guy who showed up without being on the list. Like he had any authority whatsoever over who got to attend the reading of William Grant's will. This guy really thought he was somebody just because he was sleeping with my ex-wife and driving her dead father's vintage Porsche, like he'd earned it through anything other than being conventionally attractive and morally flexible. I turned to look at him, taking my sweet time about it, and whispered back, I shouldn't have married the sequel to your haircut. But here we are. His face did this beautiful thing where it went from smug to confused to offended in about 3 seconds flat, which was honestly faster than I'd seen him process most information. The guy looked like he wanted to say something back, probably something he thought was clever, but would actually just confirm that his elevator didn't go all the way to the top floor. But Mr. Hargrove cleared his throat with enough force to sound like he was trying to dislodge a small animal from his windpipe. If we could all please, Hargrove started, his voice strained with the particular brand of exhaustion that comes from dealing with rich people drama. He adjusted his glasses and straightened the papers in front of him for what had to be the 5th time, and began reading in that formal, lawyerly tone that's supposed to add gravitas to legal proceedings. By the late Mr. William Grant's instructions, written and notarized on... Wait, hold on, Miranda interrupted, because of course she did. The woman had never met a moment she couldn't make about herself, or a conversation she couldn't derail with her own agenda. She sat up straighter in her chair, arranged her face into this expression of wounded innocence that she probably practiced in every reflective surface she passed, and said in this sugar-sweet voice that made my teeth ache, Daddy promised everything to me. He told me just last month that I was the only one who truly understood his vision for the company, that I was the only one he could trust to carry on his legacy. The thing about Miranda is that she could lie with the same ease most people breathe, and years of practice, I guess. Years of telling her father what he wanted to hear, telling me what I wanted to hear, telling herself whatever narrative made her feel like the protagonist in her own life story, instead of the antagonist in everyone else's. She was looking at Hargrove with these wide, innocent eyes, like butter wouldn't melt in her mouth, like she was just a grieving daughter trying to honor her father's wishes, and not a calculating opportunist who'd been measuring the drapes in his estate before he'd even gotten cold. I leaned back in my chair, this surprisingly comfortable leather thing that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, You sure about that? Because the lawyer just went from pink to ghost white, and in my experience, that's usually not the facial expression of someone about to deliver good news to entitled heiresses. Hargrove looked at me like I'd just said what he'd been thinking, but couldn't say out loud because of professional ethics or lawyer codes or whatever it is that keeps attorneys from telling their clients exactly what they think of them. His face had indeed gone through several color changes in the past few minutes, from normal lawyer beige to concerned pink to what could only be described as, oh God, this is going to be a disaster, white. The man looked like he needed a drink, a vacation, and possibly a new career in that order. Mr. Cross, he said, and there was something in his voice, respect maybe, or recognition, like he'd finally connected the dots about who I actually was versus who Miranda had probably told everyone I was. I'm glad you could make it today. Your presence is essential to these proceedings. Essential. That was an interesting word choice. Not invited, not welcome. Essential. Like I was a necessary component in whatever was about to unfold. Not just some random ex-husband who'd wandered in off the street looking for closure and maybe a little petty revenge. Miranda's smile faltered for just a second. Just a tiny crack in that perfect facade. And I watched her brain try to recalculate. You could practically see the wheels turning, trying to figure out what angle I was playing, what game I was running, why her father's lawyer was treating me like I mattered when I was supposed to be irrelevant, a footnote, a dismissed chapter in her life story that she'd moved past and upgraded from. Jessica, Miranda's cousin, was sitting 2 chairs down, and she leaned forward with this hungry look on her face like she was watching the season finale of her favorite reality show, and someone was about to flip a table. The business associate guy, I'd overheard someone call him Richard or Robert or some equally forgettable rich guy name, was suddenly paying much closer attention, his phone forgotten in his lap, sensing that whatever was about to happen was going to be more interesting than his stock portfolio updates. I wasn't there to beg for crumbs from William Grant's estate. I wasn't there to plead my case or make some emotional appeal about how I'd been a good son-in-law who'd worked hard and deserved something for my years of service to the family. I definitely wasn't there to watch Miranda and her discount Ken doll boyfriend walk away with everything while I got a pat on the head and a thanks for playing consolation prize. No, I was there to reclaim what was mine: my work, my ideas, my intellectual property that had somehow gotten tangled up in Grant family business over the years, and a little thing called dignity that I'd misplaced somewhere between saying I do and signing divorce papers. I was there because sometimes the quiet guy, the one everyone underestimates and overlooks and dismisses as harmless, is actually the most dangerous person in the room. Not because he's violent or aggressive or loud, but because he's been paying attention the whole time, collecting information, documenting everything, waiting for exactly the right moment to prove that underestimating him was the biggest mistake they ever made. And judging by the look on Hargrove's face as he opened the next envelope, that moment had finally arrived. Let me paint you a picture of the exact moment my marriage officially died. Because context matters, and also because it's the kind of story that makes you simultaneously want to laugh and throw something expensive against a wall. Miranda left on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate somehow because Tuesdays are already the worst day of the week. Past the hope of Monday, not yet close enough to Friday to matter, just existing in this limbo of mediocrity. She'd packed 3 suitcases, taken the good coffee maker that I'd actually purchased with my own money, and left me with a speech that she'd clearly rehearsed in the mirror because it came out way too smooth, way too practiced, like she was performing a monologue in some community theater production of Terrible People Ruin Lives. "You lack ambition, Julian," she'd said, standing in our living room. Well, my living room now, since she was abandoning ship, wearing designer workout clothes that cost more than some people's rent and had never seen the inside of an actual gym. "I need someone who wants more out of life, someone who's going places, someone who's not content with just this." She'd gestured around our apartment with this dismissive little wave, like we were living in some kind of hovel instead of a perfectly nice 2-bedroom in a decent neighborhood that I'd worked my tail off to afford. Here's the thing she really meant. The translation for anyone who doesn't speak fluent entitled princess. I wasn't buying her father's approval fast enough. I wasn't climbing the corporate ladder at Grant Industries with the speed and enthusiasm she'd expected. I wasn't dropping enough cash on new handbags, designer shoes, weekend trips to wine country, and all the other accessories she needed to maintain her lifestyle brand on social media. I was too busy actually working, actually building things, actually trying to create something meaningful instead of just playing dress up in her father's company and pretending to be important. The kicker? She said all of this while standing next to the prototype for what would eventually become the core technology behind Cross Dynamics. This clean energy converter I'd been developing in our spare bedroom, the thing I'd spent 18 months and most of my savings perfecting. She literally couldn't see the ambition that was sitting 3 feet away from her, probably because it wasn't wearing a designer label or driving a car with an unnecessary number of cylinders. So she left. Moved in with Bryce 2 days later, which meant they'd definitely been sleeping together for months before the official divorce announcement, but I digress. And I had a choice to make. I could either spiral into some pathetic depression spiral involving too much whiskey and bad decisions, or I could take every ounce of rage, humiliation, and heartbreak and channel it into something productive. Guess which option I went with? I rebuilt myself from the ground up, like some kind of personal renovation project. Except instead of HGTV, it was more like a revenge montage in an action movie where the hero comes back stronger, smarter, and significantly better dressed. First order of business was actually launching Cross Dynamics as a legitimate company, instead of just a pipe dream I was tinkering with in my spare time. I took the technology I'd developed, the patents I'd been smart enough to file in my own name before Miranda could get her perfectly manicured claws into them, and I built something real. My buddy Marcus, this guy I'd gone to college with who'd become a venture capitalist and actually understood that the future of energy wasn't going to look like the past. He saw what I was building and immediately wrote me a check. Not a small check. The kind of check that makes you double-check the number of zeros and then call the person to make sure they didn't have a stroke while writing it. He brought in 2 of his partners, and suddenly I had actual funding, actual resources, actual momentum. Within 3 months, we had a working prototype that was twice as efficient as anything currently on the market. Within 5 months, we had 3 major corporations interested in licensing the technology. Within 7 months, Cross Dynamics was valued at more than Grant Industries had ever been, even during its peak years when William was in his prime and actually running things instead of letting Miranda pretend to be a businesswoman on Instagram. The irony was almost too perfect. William Grant had laughed at my clean energy idea when I'd pitched it at one of those excruciating family dinners where everyone drank too much wine and said things they'd regret later. He'd literally laughed, this condescending chuckle while cutting his overpriced steak, and said something like, "That's adorable, Julian." Very optimistic. But the real money is in staying with proven markets, proven technologies. This environmental stuff is just a fad for millennials who don't understand how the real world works. He'd patted me on the shoulder like I was a child who just suggested we could solve world hunger with lemonade stands and good intentions. Guess who was wrong? Hint, it was the dead guy whose company was currently hemorrhaging value, while mine was being courted by Fortune 500 companies and international conglomerates. But the transformation wasn't just about business. I'd also invested in myself in ways that had nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with becoming the kind of man who doesn't apologize for taking up space in the world. I joined a gym, not one of those luxury fitness clubs where people went to be seen, but a real gym with actual weights and people who were there to work, not to pose for selfies. I hired a personal trainer named Deshaun, who was basically a drill sergeant disguised as a fitness professional, and he whipped me into the best shape of my life while also serving as an unpaid therapist who told me to stop being a doormat and start acting like I deserved good things. I upgraded my wardrobe with the help of my friend Priya, who worked in fashion and had opinions about everything from collar styles to the correct break-in pants. She took one look at my closet full of department store suits and business casual clothes that screamed, "Trying hard but not quite making it," and said, "Honey, we're burning all of this and starting over." We didn't actually burn anything because that would be wasteful and possibly illegal, but we did donate about 70% of my clothes and rebuilt my wardrobe from scratch with pieces that actually fit, actually looked good, and actually made me feel like someone worth paying attention to. So when I walked into that law office for the will reading, I wasn't just physically present. I was a completely different version of myself. The navy suit I was wearing was custom tailored by this incredible tailor in the city that Marcus had recommended and cut to fit my new, significantly more athletic frame. No tie, because I decided that the new Julian Cross didn't do things just because convention said so. My hair was cut by someone who charged more per hour than I used to make in a day, and it looked effortlessly good instead of trying too hard good. I'd even invested in decent shoes, Italian leather, handmade, the kind that last decades if you take care of them and make a subtle but definite statement about the kind of man wearing them. The suit didn't just whisper revenge. It whispered sustainable, ethical, successful revenge. Revenge that had made me a better person instead of a bitter one. Revenge that was profitable and publicly traded and making the world slightly less terrible in the process. Mr. Hargrove had looked at me like he'd seen a ghost with stock options and a diversified portfolio. His eyes had widened, his mouth had actually dropped open a little bit, and you could practically see him recalculating everything he thought he knew about William Grant's former son-in-law. This wasn't the downtrodden, slightly rumpled guy who used to show up to family events looking vaguely uncomfortable in clothes that didn't quite fit right. This was someone who looked like he'd walked out of a CEO profile in a business magazine. Someone who clearly had his life together in ways that made other people question their own choices. And Miranda? Oh, Miranda looked like someone who'd just realized she was watching a completely different movie than the one she thought she'd bought tickets for. The smug confidence drained out of her face like water from a broken glass, replaced by this dawning horror as she understood, maybe for the first time, that she'd miscalculated, badly, that the husband she'd dismissed as unambitious and traded in for upgrade had actually been the prize all along, and she'd thrown him away for someone whose greatest accomplishment was having abs and a trust fund. Hargrove finally managed to find his voice again, after what felt like an eternity of throat clearing and paper shuffling, though I suspected he was really just buying time to figure out how to deliver whatever bomb he was about to drop without getting sued, screamed at, or physically assaulted by my ex-wife, who had a documented history of throwing expensive objects when things didn't go her way. I'd once watched her hurl a $400 vase across our living room because her favorite restaurant was fully booked on Valentine's Day, so the man's caution was not unwarranted. Before we proceed with the primary distribution of assets, he said, his voice gaining a little more strength but still carrying that edge of someone who knows they're about to ruin someone's entire day, week, and possibly year. I need to confirm the presence and validity of Mr. William Grant's supplemental will, which was drafted and notarized 3 weeks before his passing. He emphasized the word supplemental, like it was some kind of legal grenade he was pulling the pin on. And honestly, given the way the room's energy shifted, he wasn't wrong. Miranda's head snapped up so fast, I'm surprised she didn't give herself whiplash. Her perfectly shaped eyebrows, because of course she'd gotten them microbladed or threaded or whatever the current trend was, drew together in this expression of confusion mixed with the first real hint of panic I'd seen on her face all afternoon. Supplemental? She repeated, like the word was in a foreign language she'd never studied. What do you mean, supplemental? Daddy's will was finalized 2 years ago. I was there when he signed it. We celebrated with champagne at the Grill afterward. Of course they'd celebrated with champagne. Of course it had been at the Grill, which was the kind of restaurant where you needed a reservation 3 months in advance and a bank account that could handle appetizers that cost more than most people's car payments. The mental image of Miranda and her father toasting to a will that she'd assumed would make her rich was almost too on brand to be believed. Bryce leaned over to her, and I could see his brain working overtime, which for him meant it was operating at what most people would consider slightly below average capacity, trying to process this new information. "What's that mean?" he whispered, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear because the man had the volume control of a drunk person at a library. "Like, what's supplemental? Is that good or bad?" I couldn't help myself. The opportunity was just too perfect, sitting there like a beautifully wrapped gift that I got to open in front of everyone. I leaned forward slightly, caught Bryce's eye, and said with the kind of smile that definitely didn't reach my eyes, "It means you're about to Google the word disinherit, my friend. Probably want to open a private browsing window for that one. Save yourself some embarrassment when it shows up in your search history." His face went through this spectacular journey of emotions, confusion, offense, more confusion, a dawning awareness that maybe he should be worried, and then back to confusion because following complex thoughts was clearly not his strong suit. Miranda shot me a look that could have melted steel, but I was enjoying myself too much to care. I'd spent 5 years of my life being the good guy, the understanding husband, the one who didn't make waves or start fights or say the things I was actually thinking. That version of Julian Cross had died the day she'd walked out with my coffee maker. And this new version? This version said exactly what he was thinking and enjoyed every second of it. Hargrove reached for a manila envelope that had been sitting slightly apart from the other documents. I'd noticed it earlier, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. The envelope looked official, with multiple seals and signatures visible, even from where I was sitting. The kind of legal document that comes with enough bureaucratic weight to sink a small ship. His hands were trembling slightly as he opened it, which was either a sign of his nervousness about what was coming or possibly just excitement at getting to witness what was clearly going to be some world-class family drama. Lawyers are human too, after all, and this had to be more interesting than the usual estate settlements where everyone was polite and sad and nobody threatened to throw anything. He pulled out several documents, and I could see they were covered in that dense legal text that attorneys love and normal people need a translator to understand. But even from my seat, I could make out William Grant's signature at the bottom of the top page, along with a notary seal and several witness signatures. This wasn't some hastily scribbled note or dubious last-minute change. This was official, legal, and very, very real. "These documents," Hargrove continued, and now he was looking directly at me, with an expression that was part professional neutrality and part something that looked almost like satisfaction, "represent a comprehensive transfer of all primary business holdings previously designated to Miranda Catherine Grant, now to be transferred instead to Julian Alexander Cross, effective immediately upon Mr. Grant's death." The silence that followed was so absolute, so complete, that I could hear the air conditioning humming in the vents above us. I could hear Jessica's sharp intake of breath from across the room. I could hear the ticking of the ornate clock on the wall that probably cost more than a semester of college tuition. The world had basically hit pause, and everyone was frozen in this moment of collective what the hell just happened shock. Miranda's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like a fish that had suddenly found itself on dry land and was trying to figure out how it had gotten there. Her face went through several color changes, pale white, then flushed red, then an alarming shade of purple that made me briefly wonder if I should be concerned about her blood pressure. "That's impossible," she finally managed to say, her voice coming out strangled and higher pitched than normal. That's absolutely impossible. Daddy hated him. He thought Julian was... He said... She was struggling to form complete sentences, her brain apparently short-circuiting as it tried to process this new reality that contradicted everything she'd assumed about her life. A nice guy with cute ideas but no real business sense? I offered helpfully. Yeah, he said that to my face multiple times. Usually after a few drinks at family dinners. Good times. Real confidence builder, those conversations. He wouldn't, Miranda insisted, and now she was standing up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. The papers in front of Hargrove rustled slightly, and everyone in the room tensed like we were watching a nature documentary right before the predator strikes. This is fraud. This is forgery. Julian must have... He's been planning this. He somehow forged Daddy's signature. Yeah, I interrupted, because watching her spiral was entertaining, but I also had places to be, and this was taking longer than necessary. But apparently your father hated fraud more than he ever disliked me, which, considering some of the financial creative writing you've been doing with company accounts over the past year, and yes, I know about that. We'll get to that part later, is actually pretty understandable when you think about it. Bryce had gone completely silent, which was possibly the smartest thing he'd done all day. He looked like someone who'd just watched his meal ticket spontaneously combust, which wasn't far from the truth. His face had taken on this grayish quality, and I watched him do some quick mental math, probably calculating how many months he could survive on whatever was left in his trust fund before he'd need to find another wealthy girlfriend or, God forbid, get an actual job. Richard or Robert or whatever his name was let out a low whistle, then tried to cover it with a cough when Hargrove shot him a look. Jessica was practically vibrating with excitement, her phone already out and undoubtedly texting everyone she knew about this absolute disaster of a will reading that she got to witness firsthand. The air in the room felt electric, charged with the kind of tension that comes right before everything explodes into chaos. And I sat there thinking that this was exactly the kind of moment that made the past 7 months of hard work, early mornings, late nights, and personal transformation completely worth it. Just when I thought this whole situation couldn't get any more surreal or entertaining. And trust me, watching Miranda's face go through more color changes than a mood ring in a tornado had already set a pretty high bar for entertainment value. Hargrove did something I absolutely wasn't expecting. He reached into his briefcase and this expensive leather thing that had probably been with him through decades of estate settlements and family drama, and pulled out a small digital recorder. Not a phone, not a laptop, but an actual standalone recording device, which immediately told me that whatever was on this thing was important enough to warrant its own dedicated hardware. Mr. Grant was very specific about the order in which these documents were to be presented, Hargrove said, and there was something in his voice now that sounded almost apologetic, like he knew what was coming and felt bad about it, but also kind of didn't, because his job was to execute his client's wishes, not to protect people's feelings. He insisted that before we proceed with any signatures or finalizations, this audio statement be played in its entirety, with all parties present. Miranda looked like she was going to object. Her mouth opened, her hand came up in that imperious gesture she used when she was about to demand something. But Hargrove held up one finger in a surprisingly authoritative move for a guy who'd spent most of this meeting looking like he wanted to crawl under his desk and hide. Mrs. Collins, he said, using her married name, which technically wasn't even accurate anymore, since she'd reverted to Grant after the divorce. Your father was extremely clear on this point. The recording plays in full without interruption, or the entire will becomes contestable. Those were his exact words. That shut her up real quick. The threat of making the will contestable meant lawyers, court dates, legal fees, and the possibility that everything could get tied up in probate for years. Even Miranda, with her limited understanding of how consequences work, could grasp that fighting this particular battle wasn't worth it. Hargrove placed the recorder on the table, adjusted his glasses one more time. I was starting to think it was a nervous habit rather than an actual vision issue, and pressed play. There was a brief moment of static, that crackling sound that digital recordings sometimes make, and then William Grant's voice filled the room, and I swear to God, it was like the man had reached up from beyond the grave specifically to wreck his daughter's entire existence. If you're hearing this, William's voice said, and it sounded exactly like I remembered. Gruff, no nonsense, with that particular edge that wealthy men who've spent their lives getting their way tend to develop. My daughter is probably still interrupting people. Miranda, sweetie, I love you, but you have absolutely no patience and even less self-awareness, which is really saying something considering how much therapy your mother paid for over the years. I had been taking a sip of the coffee that Hargrove's assistant had brought me earlier. Decent coffee, much better than the sludge they usually serve at law offices. And I nearly snorted it straight through my nose. I managed to swallow it instead, but it was a close call, and I had to cover my mouth with my hand to keep from laughing out loud. This was already worth the price of admission, and we were literally 5 seconds into the recording. Miranda's face had gone from purple back to white so fast I was genuinely concerned she might pass out. Her hands were gripping the armrests of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had gone bloodless, and I could see a vein in her temple that I didn't remember being visible before. Maybe that was new. Maybe this whole experience was giving her stress-induced vascular issues. I decided I didn't care enough to worry about it. You betrayed the company, William continued, and his voice had lost all traces of affection now, replaced by this cold, hard tone that I'd heard him use on business competitors and people who'd tried to screw him over. Don't think I didn't know about the accounts you were skimming from. Don't think I didn't notice the contracts you were steering toward Bryce's father's company in exchange for kickbacks. I'm old, Miranda, not stupid. There's a difference, though. You never seem to grasp that distinction. Oh, this was good. This was better than good. This was the kind of content that made reality television executives weep with joy. I glanced over at Bryce, who had somehow managed to turn an even more alarming shade of gray. He looked like someone who'd just realized that his entire life was built on a foundation of lies, questionable ethics, and the mistaken belief that nobody was paying attention. The man looked like he wanted to sue gravity for keeping him in the room instead of letting him float away to somewhere less incriminating. And speaking of Bryce, William's voice continued, like the dead man could somehow sense that we were all thinking about Miranda's boyfriend, and wanted to address him directly. Your new boyfriend is an idiot. I've met golden retrievers with better business instincts. I've met houseplants with more going on upstairs. The man once tried to explain cryptocurrency to me using analogies about Pokemon cards. And I genuinely wasn't sure if he was joking or if that was actually the limit of his understanding of complex financial systems. Spoiler alert, it was the latter. I lost it. I actually lost it. There was no containing the laughter at that point, and it burst out of me in this completely undignified snort that echoed through the office. Even Hargrove's assistant, who'd been trying to maintain professional neutrality this entire time, cracked a smile and had to look down at her tablet to hide it. Jessica was openly laughing, not even trying to be subtle about it anymore. Richard Robert was shaking with silent laughter, his face red from the effort of trying not to make noise. Bryce looked like a man who'd just had his entire existence summed up and dismissed in 3 sentences by a dead guy. And honestly, I couldn't have asked for a better outcome if I'd scripted it myself. The recording wasn't done. William's voice took on a different quality now, something almost respectful. Julian built what you stole, he said, and I felt my throat tighten unexpectedly because this was the validation I hadn't even realized I'd been waiting for. The clean energy patents, the business model for Cross Dynamics, even the initial prototypes that you claimed were company property, all his work, all his ideas. You slapped your name on his achievements and then threw him away when you thought you'd extracted everything useful. That's not business, Miranda. That's theft. And it's beneath even you, which is really saying something. There was a pause in the recording, and I could hear William take a breath like he was preparing for the final blow. Julian, if you're hearing this, know that you deserve better than my daughter. You deserve better than my company. You deserve better than the way this family treated you. You built something real, something meaningful. And you did it with integrity that none of us had. So here's everything I can give you to make up for the years you wasted trying to earn respect from people who didn't deserve yours. Take it, build something better, and please, for the love of God, feed my dog better than Miranda did. She kept giving him those organic, grain-free treats that cost $40 a bag, and the poor animal had digestive issues for 6 months. The recording ended with a click, and the silence that followed was somehow even more profound than before. Miranda looked like she'd been hit by a truck, backed over by the same truck, and then had the truck park on top of her for good measure. Her scarlet face was now streaked with tears that she was trying very hard not to let fall, and failing spectacularly. That's fake, she finally managed to choke out, her voice cracking. That's someone edited that. That's not real. It can't be real. Hargrove, bless him, held up a notarized affidavit with what looked like about 17 different official seals on it. Actually, ma'am, he said with the kind of professional courtesy that barely masked his complete lack of sympathy, it's certified by 3 independent witnesses, including myself, and has been authenticated by 2 separate audio forensics experts. Legally, and if I may say so, emotionally, this is as real as it gets. I sat there grinning like an idiot, watching karma get served with crystal clear Dolby audio quality, and thinking that sometimes the universe really does have a sense of humor. Just when I genuinely believed this will reading had reached peak entertainment value, and I'm talking Netflix Special That Wins awards level of dramatic content, the door to the conference room opened with this soft, deliberate click that somehow cut through all the tension like a knife through extremely expensive butter. Everyone's heads turned simultaneously, which would have been comical if we weren't all so invested in whatever fresh chaos was about to unfold, and standing in the doorway was Mr. Porter, William Grant's butler, of approximately 300 years, give or take a few decades. Now, I need to paint you a proper picture of Mr. Porter, because the man was basically what you'd get if someone asked a movie casting director to find the most stereotypically perfect British butler in existence and then gave him an actual job at an actual estate. He was probably in his late 70s, rail thin, impeccably dressed in a 3-piece suit that looked like it had been pressed approximately 5 minutes ago, and he had this posture that made everyone else in the room suddenly aware that they were slouching. His silver hair was combed back perfectly, his shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and he carried himself with the kind of dignity that made you want to apologize for existing in his general vicinity. More importantly, and more interestingly, he was carrying a mahogany box, not a small box. Either this thing was probably 2 feet long, ornately carved with these intricate patterns that screamed expensive family heirloom that's probably insured for more than your car. And it looked heavy based on the way he was holding it with both hands, even though the man's arms weren't shaking at all, because apparently British butlers are also secretly weightlifters, or maybe just built different. My apologies for the interruption, Mr. Porter said in this accent that was so perfectly posh it sounded almost fake. Except I knew it wasn't because I'd heard him speak dozens of times at family gatherings where I'd felt perpetually out of place. However, Mr. Grant left very specific instructions regarding the timing of this delivery. He stepped fully into the room, and I noticed Hargrove actually straightened up in his chair, which told me that even the lawyer hadn't been expecting this particular development. Mr. Porter's eyes swept across the room with a kind of assessing gaze that probably came from decades of watching wealthy people behave badly at dinner parties and learning to anticipate disaster before it happened. His gaze lingered on Miranda for a moment, and something flickered across his face. Not quite satisfaction, but maybe something adjacent to it. Professional vindication, perhaps. The expression of someone who'd known this was coming and had been waiting patiently for the shoe to drop. Miss Grant, he said, and the fact that he didn't call her Mrs. Collins or even acknowledge her married name felt deliberate and slightly savage. Mr. Grant was quite explicit in his written instructions. Should you protest the contents of his supplemental will, should you contest the audio recording, or should you in any way attempt to interfere with the execution of his final wishes, I was to deliver this directly to Mr. Cross. He turned to face me, and I swear the man almost smiled. Almost. It was like watching a statue consider the possibility of having emotions. Mr. Cross, he said, with what I can only describe as actual respect in his voice, which was more than I'd ever gotten from him during my marriage to Miranda when I was just the slightly awkward son-in-law who didn't know which fork to use for the salad course. Mr. Grant wanted you to have this. He spent considerable time assembling these materials and asked me to ensure they reached you at precisely this moment. He walked over to where I was sitting. Everyone else in the room had basically turned into statues, watching this unfold, like it was the climax of a murder mystery and we were all waiting to find out who done it, and placed the mahogany box on the table directly in front of me. The thing was heavier than it looked, based on the solid thunk it made when it contacted the wood. And up close, I could see that the carvings weren't just decorative patterns, but actually depicted various scenes of justice, betrayal, and retribution. William Grant had apparently commissioned a custom revenge box, which was simultaneously extra as hell and also kind of brilliant. May I asked, looking at Hargrove, because even though I was enjoying this immensely, I still had enough sense to make sure I wasn't about to violate some legal protocol that would come back to bite me later. Hargrove nodded enthusiastically, like a kid who'd been given permission to open presents on Christmas morning. Please do. This is apparently part of the official estate settlement, so yes, absolutely. Open it right now while we're all here to witness whatever Mr. Grant left for you. I lifted the lid. The hinges were well oiled and moved silently, which felt appropriate for something this dramatic. And inside was a collection of materials that made my eyebrows climb toward my hairline. There were photographs, dozens of them, printed on high-quality photo paper and organized in neat stacks with colored tabs marking different categories. There were ledgers, the old-fashioned kind with actual handwritten entries, which seemed wildly outdated until I realized they were probably intentionally low-tech to avoid any digital trail. And sitting right on top of everything, impossible to miss, was a USB drive with a label that had been written in William's distinctive handwriting. Plan B, for when my daughter acts like my ex-wife. I actually laughed out loud at that. Not a polite chuckle, not a restrained acknowledgement of humor, but a full, genuine laugh that came from somewhere deep in my chest. The man had labeled his backup revenge materials with a joke about his own failed marriage and his daughter's tendency to follow in her mother's footsteps. That was some next-level pettiness, combined with self-awareness, and I had to respect it. Bryce, who apparently still had some functioning brain cells left after the repeated emotional beatdowns of the past 20 minutes, leaned forward and said, "This is illegal. This has to be illegal. You can't just... Evidence obtained like this isn't..." He was grasping at straws, and everyone in the room knew it, but I had to give him credit for trying. It was like watching someone try to bail out the Titanic with a teaspoon. Admirable effort, completely futile outcome. I looked at him, really looked at him, and whispered, "You know what's actually illegal, Bryce? Embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy to commit corporate theft. But sure, let's focus on whether my dead father-in-law's documentation methods were up to your legal standards. That seems like a productive use of everyone's time." Miranda had gone completely silent now, which was arguably more terrifying than when she'd been yelling. She was just staring at the box with this expression of dawning horror, like she was watching her entire life implode in slow motion and couldn't figure out how to stop it. Her hands were shaking, actually trembling like she'd developed a sudden neurological condition, and I could see tears starting to form in her eyes again, though whether they were tears of rage, fear, or genuine remorse was anybody's guess. My money was on rage mixed with fear, because Miranda had never been particularly good at actual remorse. Mr. Porter, still standing beside the table like an extremely well-dressed sentinel, cleared his throat gently. "There's also a note, sir," he said, pointing to a cream-colored envelope that I'd somehow missed in my initial survey of the box's contents. "Mr. Grant asked me to ensure you read it aloud if you felt comfortable doing so." I picked up the envelope. Heavy paper stock, the expensive kind that rich people use for important correspondence, because apparently regular paper isn't good enough when you're dropping truth bombs from beyond the grave, and opened it carefully. Inside was a single card with William's handwriting, and I have to admit my hands weren't entirely steady as I unfolded it because despite everything, despite the divorce and the humiliation and the years of feeling like I wasn't good enough for his family, the man had ultimately chosen to believe in me. I read it aloud, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "Julian, patience wins wars, not battles. You played the long game better than anyone I've ever known, myself included. Consider this my final move in a game I didn't realize we were playing until it was too late. Everything in this box is authenticated, documented, and legally obtained. Use it wisely. P.S. Don't let them near the bourbon cabinet. It's vintage, and they have no appreciation for quality." Miranda was shaking so hard now that her chair was actually rattling slightly against the floor. Her carefully constructed empire, built on her father's name and money and reputation, was melting like cheap mascara in a rainstorm, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do to stop it. I didn't go straight home after the will reading, mostly because I needed about 45 minutes to decompress, and also because I wanted to grab some actual food that wasn't law office coffee and the stale cookies that Hargrove's assistant had offered around 3 o'clock. When it became clear this meeting was going to take significantly longer than anyone had anticipated, I ended up at this diner near my apartment. One of those classic American places with red vinyl booths, a jukebox that hadn't worked since the Clinton administration. and a waitress named Dolores who'd seen some things in her 6 decades of life and was completely unimpressed by anyone's drama, which I found deeply comforting. I ordered a burger, fries, and the kind of chocolate milkshake that cardiologists probably show to medical students as a cautionary tale. And I sat there in my expensive suit in a booth that had definitely seen better days, with the mahogany revenge box sitting on the seat beside me like some kind of extremely fancy companion. A couple of people gave me weird looks, probably wondering what kind of person brings what looks like a pirate treasure chest to a diner. But this was the city, and people had seen weirder things on the subway that morning, so nobody said anything. By the time I got back to my apartment, it was almost 7 in the evening. And the adrenaline from the will reading was finally starting to wear off, leaving me with this weird combination of exhaustion and buzzing energy that made me feel like I'd drunk about 17 espressos and then run a marathon. I kicked off my Italian leather shoes, which had held up beautifully through the day, but were still dress shoes and therefore instruments of foot torture, grabbed a beer from my fridge, and sat down at my desk with the mahogany box positioned directly in front of me like it was some kind of holy relic. The USB drive was small, unremarkable except for William's handwritten label, the kind of flash drive you could buy at any electronics store for about 15 bucks. Except this $15 piece of plastic and circuits apparently contained enough evidence to completely destroy my ex-wife's life, which gave it a value that couldn't really be measured in dollars. I turned it over in my hands for a minute, thinking about whether I really wanted to open this particular Pandora's box. And then I remembered Miranda's fake laugh from the will reading, and decided that yes, I absolutely did want to know what was on this thing. I plugged it into my laptop, a nice setup I'd invested in when Cross Dynamics started taking off, because trying to run a multi-million-dollar company on a 5-year-old computer that took 10 minutes to boot up had been one of my less brilliant ideas, and waited for the drive to mount. The folder that appeared was meticulously organized, which didn't surprise me because William Grant had been many things, but disorganized wasn't one of them. There were subfolders labeled by date, by type of evidence, by people involved, and one folder right at the top labeled Start Here, in all caps, which I appreciated because it meant I didn't have to guess where to begin. I opened that folder first, and inside was a video file with a timestamp from about 4 months ago. I double-clicked it, and suddenly I was watching security camera footage from what looked like William's study. I recognized the built-in bookshelves and that ugly abstract painting that Miranda's mother had commissioned from some artist who was probably famous, but whose work looked like a toddler had sneezed paint onto a canvas and called it Vision. The video showed a board meeting, or at least what passed for a board meeting when half the board was family members who'd inherited their positions rather than earning them. Miranda was there, dressed in one of those power suits that cost more than some people's monthly rent and somehow still managed to look like she was playing dress-up in her mother's closet. And there was Bryce, sitting beside her in a chair he definitely hadn't been invited to occupy, looking smug and entitled, and exactly like someone who thought rules applied to other people. The audio quality was surprisingly good. William had apparently invested in decent security equipment, which made sense for a man who'd built his fortune by being paranoid about who was trying to screw him over. I watched as Miranda presented a proposal for restructuring Grant Holdings' investment portfolio, using terminology she'd clearly memorized, without understanding and making recommendations that anyone with actual business training would recognize as somewhere between incompetent and actively fraudulent. But the really interesting part came about 15 minutes into the video, after most of the other board members had left, and it was just Miranda, Bryce, and one of the company accountants, a nervous-looking guy named Edwin, who I vaguely remembered from a Christmas party, where he'd spent the entire evening standing in a corner drinking eggnog, and looking like he wanted to be literally anywhere else. Bryce, in his infinite wisdom and complete lack of awareness that there might be cameras recording everything, started bragging about what he called merging assets with Miranda. And by merging assets, he apparently meant funneling company money through shell corporations that his father owned, taking kickbacks on contracts that should have gone through proper bidding processes, and generally engaging in the kind of financial creativity that made actual accountants break out in hives. "We're building something here," Bryce said on the video, gesturing expansively like he was some kind of visionary instead of a trust fund baby committing multiple felonies. "Your dad's too old school to see it, but we're positioning ourselves for when he's gone. By the time anyone figures out what we've done, we'll be untouchable." I actually paused the video at that point because I was laughing too hard to hear the rest. The man had literally said, "When anyone figures out what we've done, while being recorded by a security camera in a house that he knew had security cameras because he'd probably walked past a dozen of them on his way to the study. This was the guy Miranda had left me for. This was the upgrade she'd traded up to. A man who'd incriminated himself on camera and apparently thought he was some kind of criminal mastermind for doing basic white-collar crime that prosecutors dream about because it's so easy to prove. There were more videos, dozens of them, actually. Board meetings where Miranda had pushed through contracts that benefited Bryce's family companies. Financial transfers that even I could see were sketchy, and I wasn't an accountant or a lawyer. Emails that had somehow been printed and photographed, showing coordination between Miranda and Bryce to systematically drain value from Grant Holdings while making it look like legitimate business expenses. William had been documenting everything. For months, maybe longer, he'd known exactly what his daughter was doing. And instead of confronting her directly or trying to stop her through official channels, he'd just quietly collected evidence like some kind of corporate detective building an ironclad case. I grabbed my phone and called Liam Ortiz, my lawyer. Not the lawyer who'd handled my divorce, because that guy had been competent but boring. But the lawyer I'd hired when Cross Dynamics started getting serious, and I needed someone who understood both business law and how to fight dirty when necessary. Liam was about my age, former prosecutor who'd switched to defense work because it paid better, and he had this amazing ability to look at complicated legal situations and immediately identify the jugular. "Tell me you're calling with good news," Liam answered on the second ring, because the man apparently never slept and was always available, which was one of the many reasons I paid him entirely too much money and felt good about it. "I'm calling with the kind of evidence that's going to make your entire month," I said, and I could hear him sit up straighter on the other end of the line, probably abandoning whatever he'd been doing to give me his full attention. "I'm listening." I gave him the abbreviated version, the will reading, the audio recording, the mahogany box, and now the USB drive full of video evidence documenting enough fraud and embezzlement to keep a team of federal prosecutors busy for the next several years. I could hear him typing furiously on his end, probably taking notes or maybe just stress typing because lawyers do that when they're excited. When I finished, there was a long pause, and then Liam let out this low whistle that I'd learned meant he was impressed and also already calculating how we were going to use this information. "You've got everything," he said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, breach of fiduciary duty, and if I'm reading between the lines correctly, Bryce also has monumentally bad hair, which isn't illegal, but should be. "The hair is truly offensive," I agreed. "What do we do with all this?" "We file it," Liam said immediately. "We file it quietly, properly, through official channels with the SEC, the State Attorney General's office, and probably the IRS, because if they were doing this much fraud in the stuff we can see, they were definitely creative with their taxes. We do it by the book, we do it correctly, and we make absolutely sure that when this hits, it hits hard enough that they can't wiggle out of it or claim it's a misunderstanding." We spent the next 2 hours on the phone and video chat, going through files, organizing evidence, and building a case that was basically prosecutorial gift wrapping. Liam kept making these little satisfied noises as we went through each piece of documentation, like a chef tasting a particularly good sauce, and by the time we finished, it was almost midnight, and I was exhausted but also deeply satisfied. We filed everything the next morning, electronically, with hard copies sent by courier to make absolutely sure there was no question about timing or receipt. Official complaints, evidence packets, notarized statements, the works. It was the kind of filing that lands on desks and makes experienced investigators sit up and pay attention because everything is organized, documented, and handed to them with a bow on top. By 10 a.m., my phone started buzzing with news alerts. By 11, it had basically become unusable from the sheer volume of notifications, messages, and calls from reporters who'd apparently gotten wind that something big was happening with Grant Holdings. Miranda's call came at precisely 2:30 in the afternoon, 3 days after the news outlets had collectively lost their minds over the Grant Holdings scandal. I was in the middle of a meeting with potential investors for Cross Dynamics, 3 venture capitalists from Silicon Valley who were interested in expanding our clean energy technology into international markets. When my phone buzzed with her name on the screen, I almost declined it out of principle, but something made me excuse myself and step out into the hallway to answer. Probably the same morbid curiosity that makes people slow down to look at car accidents on the highway. "We need to talk," Miranda said without preamble, skipping right over basic greetings like hello or I'm sorry I stole from my father's company and also ruined your life for 5 years. Her voice had this forced calm quality to it, like someone who'd been coached by a lawyer or therapist on how to sound reasonable when they were actually barely holding it together. This doesn't have to be a war, Julian. We can settle this privately, like adults. Come to the mansion, tonight, 7 o'clock. The mansion. Of course it had to be the mansion. The Grant family estate in Connecticut that looked like someone had seen a French chateau in a magazine and decided to recreate it with American money and significantly less taste. The place where I'd spent countless uncomfortable holidays and family gatherings feeling like an interloper in my own marriage, where every room reminded me that I'd never quite measure up to Miranda's standards or her father's expectations. The place where, ironically, I was now the legal owner of approximately 60% of everything, including the hideous chandelier in the foyer that Miranda's mother had insisted was an investment piece. Let me guess, I said, leaning against the hallway wall and watching a paralegal speed walk past with an armful of files that looked dangerously unstable. You've got some kind of settlement offer that you think I'll be stupid enough to sign? Maybe a nice round number that sounds impressive until you compare it to what I'm actually entitled to? There was a pause on her end, and I could practically hear her recalculating her approach. Just come to the mansion, Julian. 7 o'clock. We can discuss this face to face without lawyers screaming at each other and reporters camped outside our doors. Don't you want this to be over? I told her I'd think about it and hung up, mostly because I wanted to finish my meeting with the investors and also because making her wait seemed like the appropriate power move. Then I immediately called Liam, because despite my newfound confidence and significantly improved wardrobe, I wasn't completely stupid, and I knew that walking into Miranda's territory without consulting my lawyer first was exactly the kind of move that ended with me signing something I'd regret. She wants to meet at the mansion, I told Liam after explaining the call. Tonight at 7. Private settlement discussion, no lawyers present, just the two of us, having a reasonable adult conversation. Liam snorted so loudly, I had to pull the phone away from my ear. That's not a meeting, Julian. That's an ambush with appetizers. She's going to have every advantage. Home territory, probably Bryce lurking in the background like a discount henchman, documents pre-prepared. That sound good on the surface, but screw you 6 ways from Sunday in the fine print. This is a trap. Obviously it's a trap, I agreed, watching the investors through the glass wall of the conference room, gesturing animatedly at the presentation Marcus was giving about our Q4 projections. But I'm going anyway, with a recording device. And maybe a text to you with my location in case they decide to weekend at Bernie's me and stuff my body in that horrific hedge maze that nobody can ever find their way out of. Liam sighed the sigh of a lawyer who's gotten used to his clients making questionable decisions despite his excellent advice. Fine, but I'm sending you the model number of a good recording pen. It looks like a regular pen, sounds crystal clear, and has enough battery life to record their entire villain monologue. And for the love of God, don't sign anything without photographing it and sending it to me first. I don't care if they're offering you the moon. Photograph, send, wait for my response. So at 6:45, I pulled up to the Grant mansion in my Tesla, which felt appropriately symbolic given the whole clean energy thing, and also quietly screamed, "I'm doing better than you," without being obnoxiously obvious about it. With a recording pen that looked exactly like an overpriced Mont Blanc in my jacket pocket. The sun was setting behind the house, casting these long shadows across the manicured lawn that probably required a full-time staff of gardeners to maintain. And the whole scene looked like something out of a movie about rich people having dinner parties before their secrets destroy them. The front door opened before I even reached it, revealing Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper who'd been with the Grant family for something like 30 years, and who'd always been inexplicably nice to me during my marriage, occasionally sneaking me decent leftovers after those marathon family dinners, where I'd barely eaten because I'd been too anxious about using the wrong fork. She gave me a small smile that somehow conveyed sympathy, warning, and approval all at once, which is a kind of complex emotional communication that only longtime household staff can master. "She's in the conservatory, Mr. Cross," Mrs. Chen said quietly, and the fact that she was calling me Mr. Cross instead of Mr. Julian or just Julian felt significant. "Can I get you anything before you go in? Water, something stronger? A heads up that this is probably a terrible idea?" I grinned at her. "I'm good, Mrs. Chen. But if you hear shouting, feel free to call the police or just make popcorn and enjoy the show, whatever feels appropriate. The mansion's interior looked different than I remembered, though it took me a minute to figure out why. Then I realized it had been staged. Not subtly either. There were candles everywhere, the expensive kind that probably cost $50 each and smelled like exclusive or wealth, or whatever scent wealthy people convinced themselves was worth that kind of money. Champagne was chilling in a bucket on the side table. Dom Perignon, because of course it was. Nothing but the best for a desperate attempted bribery session. The whole setup looked like Versailles on a discount budget. If Versailles had been designed by someone whose primary understanding of romance came from reality TV shows, and whose budget was limited to considerable, but not quite enough to pull off what they were going for. It was so perfectly, obviously desperate that I almost felt bad for her, almost. Then I remembered the fake laugh from the will reading and the post-it note divorce announcement, and the sympathy evaporated like morning dew in a blast furnace. Miranda was waiting in the conservatory, which was this glass-enclosed room full of plants that required constant climate control and probably cost more to maintain than most people's mortgages. She'd dressed for the occasion in what I recognized as one of her I'm approachable and reasonable outfits. Designer jeans that cost more than my first car, a cashmere sweater that probably ran about $800, minimal jewelry that was only minimal by her standards and still represented enough money to fund a small nonprofit. Her hair was down, makeup subtle, the whole presentation screaming, I'm just a reasonable person trying to have a reasonable conversation, while her eyes said, I'm in damage control mode and I need you to sign something immediately. Julian, she said, standing up from the wicker chair she'd been perched on like some kind of catalog model staging a casual moment. Thank you for coming. I know things have been complicated lately. Complicated. That was one word for it. Other words included fraudulent, criminal, humiliating, and spectacularly stupid. But sure, let's go with complicated. Let's skip the small talk, I said, staying near the doorway because I'd watched enough movies to know that sitting down was basically accepting the premise of the conversation. You've got about 5 minutes before I decide that sitting in traffic on I-95 would have been a better use of my evening. What's your offer? She flinched slightly at my tone, apparently not used to this version of me who didn't soften his edges or apologize for taking up space. Then she reached for a folder on the table, leather portfolio, probably also obscenely expensive, and slid it across toward me. Sign this, she said, and her voice had taken on this desperate edge that she was trying to hide behind confidence. You walk away with $1 million, cash. Transferred immediately. No more legal battles, no more headlines, no more dragging this family through the mud. 2 weeks later, I found myself sitting in a courtroom that looked exactly like every courtroom you've ever seen on television. Except the benches were harder, the air conditioning was somehow both too cold and insufficient, and there was this weird smell that I eventually identified as a combination of floor polish, nervous sweat, and the existential dread of people realizing their actions have consequence. The Superior Court of Connecticut wasn't exactly where I'd planned to spend my Tuesday morning, but life has a funny way of delivering entertainment in unexpected venues. And this particular venue was promising to be better than anything currently streaming on Netflix. The place was absolutely packed, standing room only, which apparently happens when a case involves wealthy people behaving badly, dead patriarchs delivering posthumous justice, and enough scandal to fuel gossip columns for the next 6 months. I'd counted at least 4 news cameras being set up in the designated media area, their operators checking angles and lighting like they were preparing to film the season finale of America's Most Dramatic Rich People. There were reporters with notebooks, sketch artists because apparently cameras weren't allowed to capture everything, and what looked like about 30 people who'd probably taken the day off work just to watch the show because when you live in Connecticut and the Grant family drama makes it to actual criminal court, you clear your schedule. Liam was sitting beside me at the plaintiff's table, or technically it was the prosecution's table, since this had evolved from a civil case into an actual criminal proceeding once the SEC and State Attorney General's office had gotten involved, and discovered that Miranda and Bryce's creative accounting was even more creative than anyone had initially suspected. He was wearing one of his court suits, the ones he reserved for occasions when he needed to look simultaneously respectable and like someone you didn't want to mess with. And he had this expression on his face that I'd learned meant he was already mentally 3 moves ahead of whatever opposing counsel was planning. "This is going to be good," he whispered to me, organizing his files with the kind of precision that made me understand why I paid him obscene amounts of money on. I've seen their witness list, I've seen their evidence list, and unless they've got a time machine and can go back and not commit multiple felonies on camera, they're screwed. The bailiff, this older guy with a gray mustache who looked like he'd seen literally everything in his 30-year career and was consequently impressed by nothing, called out, "All rise," in a voice that suggested he'd done this approximately 10,000 times and would probably do it 10,000 more before retirement. Everyone stood as Judge Patricia Caldwell entered, and I had to appreciate the cosmic irony that Miranda's case was being heard by a woman judge who had a reputation for taking exactly zero nonsense from entitled defendants and their expensive lawyers. Judge Caldwell was in her early 60s, African-American, with natural hair that she wore in an elegant, silver-streaked style, and glasses that she peered over when she wanted to make you feel like you disappointed your grandmother and the entire justice system simultaneously. She'd been appointed to the bench after a distinguished career as a prosecutor specializing in white-collar crime, which meant she'd literally built her reputation on putting people like Miranda and Bryce in prison. The universe really did have a sense of humor sometimes. "Be seated," Judge Caldwell said, arranging her robes and surveying the courtroom with the kind of look that said she'd already read all the briefs, knew exactly what kind of circus this was going to be, and had mentally prepared herself for the inevitable theatrics. "Let's begin." And that's when Miranda made her entrance. Because, of course, she couldn't just be sitting in the courtroom like a normal defendant. She had to arrive fashionably late enough to make sure everyone was watching. She swept through the doors wearing white, head to toe white, like she was attending her own baptism, or maybe auditioning for a role as a martyred saint in a community theater production of someone's fever dream. White designer suit that probably cost $5,000. White heels, even white jewelry that looked like she'd raided a pearl store and decided that subtlety was for people with less to prove. Her hair was pulled back in this severe bun that was probably meant to make her look serious and repentant, but mostly made her look like a villain in a movie about evil ballet instructors. The statement was clear. "Look at me. I'm pure and innocent and wrongly accused. Please ignore all the evidence of my crimes that's about to be presented." It was the fashion equivalent of pleading not guilty while standing next to a table full of stolen goods with your fingerprints all over them. Bryce followed about 3 steps behind her, and if Miranda looked like she was dressing for martyrdom, Bryce looked like he was auditioning for the role of nervous boyfriend number 3 in a straight-to-streaming legal thriller. He was wearing a suit that was probably expensive, but looked cheap on him because he wore it with all the confidence of someone who knew he was about to be publicly destroyed. His tie was slightly crooked. There was a visible sweat stain developing under his arms despite the aggressive air conditioning, and he kept glancing around the courtroom like he was looking for exits or possibly hoping a convenient earthquake would interrupt the proceedings. They took their seats at the defense table, flanked by their lawyers, a team of 3 attorneys from some white shoe firm in Manhattan that specialized in defending indefensible clients and charging rates that could fund small nations. The lead attorney was this guy named Bradford Whitmore III, because of course that was his name, who looked like Central Casting had sent over their most stereotypical corporate defense lawyer. Silver hair, expensive suit, American flag pin on his lapel, and an expression that suggested he was being paid enough to pretend to believe his client's version of events. "Your Honor," Bradford began as soon as Judge Caldwell indicated he could speak, and his voice had that practiced courtroom modulation that lawyers spend years perfecting. "The defense moves to exclude the video and audio evidence submitted by the prosecution on the grounds that it was obtained without proper consent and represents a violation of my client's reasonable expectation of privacy." Liam stood up smoothly, and I could tell he'd been waiting for this exact objection because he practically had to suppress a smile. "Your Honor, the recordings in question were made by security cameras in William Grant's private home and office, which he owned and operated. The defendants were guests in that home and employees of that company, both of which have established precedent regarding consent to recording in spaces where the owner has installed security systems. Additionally, Mr. Grant's estate has provided documentation showing that all visitors and employees were notified of the security camera presence through posted signs and written policies. Judge Caldwell looked at Bradford over her glasses with an expression that suggested she'd heard this argument about 40 times in her career, and it had never impressed her yet. Mr. Whitmore, are you arguing that your clients had a reasonable expectation of privacy while committing fraud in someone else's home and office, in spaces where security cameras were clearly posted? We're arguing that the selective editing and presentation of... Bradford started, but Judge Caldwell held up one hand. Motion denied. The evidence was legally obtained and properly authenticated. Let's proceed. I watched Miranda's face go through several color variations as she realized her expensive lawyer's first strategy had just been demolished in under 2 minutes. Bryce looked like he might actually be sick, which would have been inconvenient for everyone sitting near him, but would also have been kind of perfect from a karmic perspective. The prosecutor, a sharp woman in her 40s named Catherine Rodriguez, who had apparently been waiting her entire career for a case this clear-cut and satisfying, stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, the state would like to present audio evidence recorded by the deceased, Mr. William Grant, 3 weeks before his death. And here we went again. The same recording from the will reading, except now it was being played in a court of law with full legal weight behind it. William Grant's voice filled the courtroom through speakers that were probably better quality than the ones at the law office. And I watched the jury, 12 people who'd been selected specifically because they claimed to have no strong feelings about wealthy families or corporate fraud, which had to have been difficult to find in Connecticut where everyone had an opinion about both. If you're hearing this, William's voice said, and I could see several jury members lean forward slightly, my daughter's probably still interrupting people. A couple of jurors actually smiled at that, quickly suppressing it when they remembered they were supposed to maintain impartial expressions. Even Judge Caldwell's mouth twitched slightly, though she maintained her professional composure. The recording played through, hitting all the same devastating notes it had at the will reading, the acknowledgement of Miranda's betrayal, the dismissal of Bryce's intelligence, the declaration that Julian had built what they'd stolen. I watched the jury's faces as they listened, saw them glance over at Miranda and Bryce, saw the skepticism turn to something harder as William's words painted a picture of calculated theft and betrayal. But the real moment came when Catherine Rodriguez queued up the video evidence. The screens positioned around the courtroom flickered to life, and suddenly we were all watching security footage from William's study from 6 months before his death. The timestamp was clearly visible in the corner, the camera angle was perfect, and the audio quality was good enough to hear every word. The video showed Miranda and Bryce alone in the study after everyone else had left a family meeting. William was visible in the frame, sitting in his favorite chair, clearly exhausted from whatever discussion had just concluded. And then Bryce started talking to him, asking questions about his medication schedule and some golf tournament, clearly trying to keep him engaged and distracted. While Bryce kept up his stream of meaningless conversation, Miranda moved behind her father's chair, reaching for a folder on his desk. The camera caught everything, her opening the folder, removing several pages, replacing them with different pages from her purse, and sliding the folder back into position. It was so blatant, so obvious, so impossibly stupid to do while being recorded, that it almost looked like a comedy sketch, except it was real, and those were legal documents she was switching out. A year later, life was quieter. Blessedly, wonderfully, spectacularly quieter. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed, and you realize you're still standing, maybe even standing taller than before, with better posture and significantly less emotional baggage weighing you down. I'd started the Cross Foundation for Ethical Business, which sounds incredibly pretentious until you realize it's basically just me teaching MBA students and young entrepreneurs how to not marry narcissists with Wi-Fi passwords and how to document everything when working with people whose moral compasses spin like broken carnival rides. The foundation also funded clean energy startups and provided legal resources for people screwed over by corporate fraud, which felt appropriately full circle given how I'd spent the previous year. People called me the Gentleman Avenger in articles and podcast interviews, which was flattering but also vaguely embarrassing. I preferred to think of myself as just a guy who'd finally gotten a full night's sleep and stopped apologizing for existing. The media loved the story, though. Quiet husband gets revenge through patience and proper legal channels, complete with audio evidence from beyond the grave. It had everything except car chases, and honestly, I was fine without those. The mansion became mine officially after all the legal dust settled, though I only visited occasionally. Sometimes I'd sit by the pond with William's dog, a golden retriever named Senator who was living his best life now that someone was feeding him actual dog food instead of $40 a bag organic nonsense that gave him digestive issues. We'd watch the sun set over the property, and I'd think about how Miranda's fake laugh at the will reading had started everything, set off this chain reaction that ended with justice and closure, and me owning a house with more bathrooms than I knew what to do with. Do I forgive Miranda? Maybe someday, when I'm feeling particularly generous and have had enough therapy. Do I miss her? Only when I run out of reasons to laugh, which hasn't happened yet. Bryce disappeared somewhere online, apparently selling crypto investment masterclasses to people who deserved better financial advice. Miranda was doing court-ordered community service at a public library. And the irony of her, surrounded by books about ethics and consequences, must have been weeping daily. And me? I'm good. My coffee's hot. My peace is paid for in full. And the world finally knows something I'd learned the hard way. The quiet guy in the corner isn't weak. He's just loading.